Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to talk about what the Beatles thought of each other's solo careers, music-wise. So it's a subject which has always interested me, and I've kind of lamented the fact that we don't have too much material on this, because as a rule they didn't, unless they were asked, they didn't tend to comment on each other's work, and I have a sneaking feeling that they were all listening to each other's work, particularly in the early 70s, and maybe this got less and less as the 70s progressed. But anyway, so I'm going to go through the decade of the 70s more or less chronologically and give you some comments that they made on each other's work. Now, I'm going to give you what I think is reliable sources, and some of the stuff which may be speculation I've not included here. So I've got many sources for this. One of them is the Lennon Remembers famous interview which John did in December 1970, and the Playboy interview he did in 1980 as well. That's quite a big source. And then this book by Keith Badman, which is really an invaluable guide to the years after the breakup. Loads of good material, really well researched, and so that was a valuable source of, and plus numerous other ones too numerous to mention. So we'll start off in 1970 when John was asked by Jan Wenner about all three of his fellow Beatles solo work. So he started off, he was asked about All Things Must Pass, and he said it was all right. He said, it's not my kind of music, and that was a bit surprising, because I think common wisdom says that, accepted wisdom says it's an all-time classic. But I think at the time of the split, the problem was the Beatles were fed up with each other, and so the last thing they want to do is heap praise on each other's solo work, and they're probably too busy concentrating on their own, trying to break out on their own and establish a solo identity, that the last thing they wanted to do was praise the others. So John did qualify his comment by saying, if I hear George come on the radio, it's pretty damn good. And then he joked, it made me think there must be a God. Then he was asked about Ringo, and he liked Beaucoups of Blues. He said he wouldn't buy it. He did point that out. But he said it made him feel less embarrassed than with Ringo's first effort, which was Sentimental Journey. And then also when he was talking about All Things Must Pass, he said it's better than Paul's. I thought Paul's was rubbish. He even used that word, a load of light, whatever. And of course it was a light, homemade affair, but that was part of its charm, and hindsight does display its charms. But anyway, this isn't my views we're expressing in this video. This is what they thought of each other. So that was John. Paul says very little about his bandmates or ex-bandmates' work in 1970, probably because he was the most bitter of the, during the split, and he eventually took them to court on the last day of 1970. So no comments from Paul at the time anyway. George was asked to comment on Paul's first solo album, McCartney, and said he really liked Maybe I'm Amazed, and that would be something, but the rest, he says, was average. He said Teddy Boy and Junk could have been done better, but he just thinks that Paul was left to his own devices, didn't have anyone to advise him if something was not so good, apart from Linda. Whereas he said in the group days that they, if one of them came up with an idea which was no good, someone would tell the other. So that was George. Reasonably negative comment about the McCartney album, not totally negative. And then we'll move on to Ringo. He was asked in the following year, 71, what he thought of his bandmates' work, and it's in this book. So he said George is just brilliant. He loves All Things Must Pass, and he of course played on 70% of it. He thinks some of John Lennon's Plasticano Band album songs were brilliant, and he played on that. Then he was asked about Paul's, and he says, I'll try and read you the exact quote because it's very interesting, if I can find it. Okay, I can't find the exact quote, but I'll try and remember it word for word. He said, Paul is one of the most creative bass players and songwriters of all time, but he disappoints me with his solo work. He didn't think there was one worthwhile tune on Ram, the last one. He just seems to be wasting his time. He seems to be going strange. So that was none too positive. I think George made the remark that he could have made a commercial album like Ram if he'd wanted to, but it kind of rather disparaging remark, thinking, you know, Paul was only interested in being commercial, which is a totally unfair comment. Actually, that comment I'm not sure if George made, because I can't find the source for that one, so treat that one with a pinch of salt. Paul has subsequently in December '71 said he liked John's Imagine album, but he didn't like the previous ones because they were too political, which is a strange comment because John Lennon Plastic Ono Band isn't really political at all. It's very personal and soul-bearing, but political is not the word that leaps to mind. Maybe he was referring to John Lennon's peace campaigns and stuff, but it was a strange remark. And then John quickly shot back saying Imagine was political with sugar on for conservatives like yourself. This was during the low point of the post-Beatles infighting, when they were all, for want of a better word, bitching at each other in the press, no less. So that made it even worse. And if I was around at the time, old enough to be aware of this, must have been highly depressing for Beatles fans. Either that, or they probably took sides on Paul's side or on the other's sides, because it was 3 against 1 at the time. As we know, John listened intently to Ram and found some remarks aimed at him, some of which were aimed at him, like too many people preaching practices, don't let them tell you what you want to be. That, I think, Paul has admitted to. And also Three Legs pretty obviously refers to the other Beatles, although Paul has kind of denied it. I don't think he's ever admitted that one, but to my ears it's obvious that Paul is having a dig at John and the others. My dog, he got 3 legs and he can't run. But having said that, Dear Boy, which is another song which John interpreted towards him, was written about Linda's first husband, who later sadly committed suicide. So I think John overreacted. As we know, he went and did the song How Do You Sleep and had lines like, the only thing you've done was yesterday, and since you're gone, you're just another day. But that comment was taken a bit too literally by Paul. I think John was just using it as a good rhyme, and it was a good rhyme, but he wasn't insinuating that Yesterday was the only good track he did. So anyway, a little bit unpleasantness, as we've said. John remarked on Uncle Albert, saying he liked the beginning and he liked the Hands Across the Water, but he didn't like the bit where it tripped off in the middle, which I presume he means the get around bit, get your feet back on the ground, that bit. He's pretty warm towards Red Rose Speedway when that came out in '73, John is. And I guess because after the political failure of Sometime in New York City, and music was getting pretty heavy in the early '70s, and Red Rose Speedway probably came as a bit of light relief, if you want that kind of light relief, rather than heavy, spiritual stuff or political stuff. So he was quite complimentary on that album, and said later in 1980 that it was the last album of Paul's he listened to, which I don't believe, by the way. Band on the Run, he was very complimentary about. John said it's good Paul music. And Paul was asked to comment on Give Me Love, George's single in '73, and said it was an ace guitar solo, and he really liked the time changes. We have no comments from George around this time on, I couldn't find any, although he does obviously contribute to the Ringo album along with the others. In '74, it's interesting, you get all 3 of the other Beatles commenting on Walls and Bridges, pretty much all favourably. Paul said it's a good album, maybe even a great album, but it's not as good as I Am the Walrus, which is a kind of honest, down-to-earth comment. I like it. George said Walls and Bridges was, I think he used the word fantastic, or some word like that, and Ringo said it was the best album in the last 5 years. So that album went down very well with the other, John's fellow Beatles. What else have we got? In 1980, John is rumoured to have loved Paul's single Coming Up, couldn't get it out of his head, and one of the reasons he came back into the studio. In the Playboy interviews of 1980, he was talking about Long and Winding Road and Let It Be in those later Paul songs, and he says he had a kind of spurt before the Beatles split, I think, because that was about the last gasp from him. And Paul heard that and obviously was upset by that. And that clip from that interview came out before John died. And Paul was actually interviewed before John died in late 1980, responding to that comment. But I don't think they have had a chance to actually talk and resolve what John meant by that, because John could make remarks which, taken out of context, can seem quite cruel, because he also said in the same interview, because he was asked by David Sheff, what about the line, those freaks were right when they said you was dead, and John said, well, yeah, I think he did die creatively in a way. Now, you take that out of context, Paul died creatively after the Beatles, it sounds an awful remark, but the key words there are in a way, because in a way, you compare anyone's work, whether it be John, Paul, George or Ringo, to the group work, and it's going to suffer in comparison. So I think that's all he was saying. You know, he couldn't live up to that standard, and maybe John felt he couldn't live up to it, apart from on the first couple of albums. It's a hell of a thing to live up to, and he was trying to spur Paul on in the early 70s, he said, to greater things, but his comments got misunderstood, he said. George made some pretty unpleasant comments about Paul around the Broad Street time, and he was asked, why is he going back to doing old Beatles songs? And George said, because he's run out of his own songs, which was a bit of a cheek. I think he said that in '87, riding on the success of Cloud 9. A bit of a cheek for George to say that, because George had just taken a 5-year sabbatical, presumably partly because he may have run out of songs. So Paul kept going, unlike George, who gave it up for between 76 and 79, no album. Between 82 and 87, no album. So for George to say that, and Paul did object to that, I think, although I don't have his reply on officially. Another thing George said was that John lost it towards the end, in terms of was not writing very good songs towards the time of his death, which Paul objected to and said it was presumptuous. And also I think that's a ridiculous comment. We have got slightly nicer comments from George over the years, such as he praised the song from London Town I'm Carrying, said it was sensational. But they're few and far between, George's positive comments compared to his negative ones, I'm afraid. And then I heard a story that, I can't remember which book this was in, that John and Yoko, it might have been Yoko who said this, that they were sitting down listening to a Paul song, and they were in tears, or John was in tears. I think both of them were in tears. But we don't know which song it was. And when I had the pleasure of meeting Yoko, I asked her which song was it that you were listening to of Paul's, which got you feeling emotional. And she couldn't remember. And I asked her about Paul's solo career, and her knowledge was, shall we say, lacking. She wasn't even familiar with Band on the Run. So anyway, I think had John lived, I think he would have ended up saying nice things about quite a bit of Paul and George's solo career, but obviously his life was cut short. In general, I think right after the split, they were reluctant to sing the praises of the others. But once the dust has settled, and they're all reasonably good friends in latter years, maybe they were more willing to be complimentary towards each other. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the subject. Thanks for watching. See you next time.